A pale aristocrat in a black cape haunts our screens and stories. This is the Dracula we know, a creature of the night. But the real man who inspired this legend was far more terrifying, and he walked in the sunlight. His name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, a ruler history remembers as Vlad the Impaler. By the end of this journey, you will understand the shocking reality of the man whose cruelty spawned a global myth. We will strip away centuries of fiction to confront a brutal prince forged by betrayal and war. What was the true purpose behind his infamous forest of the dead? And how did a 15th century warlord become confused with a supernatural vampire? The story of Vlad is a puzzle where history, horror, and propaganda are permanently entangled. What do you believe is the darkest truth a leader can hide behind their public legacy? To understand Vlad, you must first understand the world he was born into, a world of shifting loyalties and constant danger. In the early 15th century, the land of Wallachia was less a kingdom and more a precarious chessboard. Nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, it was a vital buffer state, a thin line of defense between two colossal powers. To the south, the Ottoman Empire was expanding with relentless force, its sultans eyeing Europe. To the north and west, the Christian kingdom of Hungary stood as the bulwark of Christendom, determined to halt that advance. Wallachia's princes were forever trapped in the middle, forced to pledge allegiance to one side or the other, knowing that any choice could mean their ruin. This was not a place for weak rulers. Power here was a fleeting thing, seized and lost in brutal cycles. The local nobility, the boyars, were a constant source of intrigue, wealthy families who could make or break a prince with a whisper. They fought for their own interests, often switching sides if it meant preserving their lands and privileges. Into this volatile arena stepped Vlad II, a man of ambition and pragmatism. To secure his fragile throne, he made a fateful pact. He journeyed to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor and was inducted into a chivalric order, the Order of the Dragon. Its mission was noble: to defend Christendom against the Ottoman threat. Members wore a medallion with a dragon, its wings spread, a symbol of vigilance and strength. Vlad II embraced this symbol so fully that he took it as his name, Dracula, meaning the dragon in the Romanian language of the time. And so, when his son was born in the fortress of Siasora around the year 1428, the boy was given a title that would echo through history: Vlad Dracula. It simply meant son of the dragon, but in the common tongue, the word Dracula had a double meaning. It could also mean the devil. So to many, especially his terrified enemies, young Vlad was not the son of a chivalric knight. He was quite literally the son of the devil. A name given in honor would become a prophecy of horror. This was the inheritance of the boy who would become the Impaler, a legacy of political treachery, holy war, and a title shadowed by infernal meaning from his very first breath. For a young prince, a name can be both a shield and a target. Vlad Dracula learned this brutal lesson not in battle, but in gilded captivity. To secure his own tenuous position, his father made a desperate move. He sent his two sons, Vlad around 12 years old and his younger brother Radu, as hostages to the court of the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. This was not an act of cruelty, but a grim political transaction common for the era. The boys were human guarantees, living insurance policies to ensure their father's continued loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. If Vlad II stepped out of line, his sons would pay the price. So the young Dracula arrived at the Ottoman court in Adrianople, a prince in title but a prisoner in reality. He was treated with a strange, calculated duality. On one hand, he received an excellent education in logic, philosophy, and the art of war. He learned Turkish, studied the Quran, and was immersed in Ottoman culture and courtly etiquette. This was a deliberate strategy, a way to mold a future Wallachian ruler who would be sympathetic to Ottoman interests. Yet this education came with a constant, unspoken threat. Their lives were always in the balance, a fact made terrifyingly clear by the fate of other hostage princes before them. Every lesson, every courtesy was underscored by the knowledge that their survival depended entirely on their father's obedience. This environment forged the brothers in profoundly different ways. Vlad internalized the humiliation and the threat. He saw the luxurious court not as a place of learning, but as a beautiful cage, a symbol of the power that held his destiny hostage. He grew sullen, defiant, and bitterly resentful. Every polite instruction felt like a command from his captors. In contrast, his younger brother Radu adapted. Handsome and more diplomatic, he embraced Ottoman culture, learned its language fluently, and even formed a close, some say intimate, friendship with the Sultan's own son, a boy their age named Maimed. Where Vlad saw enemies, Radu saw opportunity. This divergence planted a poisonous seed. In Vlad's eyes, his brother's assimilation was not survival but betrayal. It deepened his isolation and cemented a worldview where there were only two kinds of people, the strong who commanded and the weak who submitted or collaborated. His hatred for the Ottomans ceased to be a political stance. It became a core part of his identity, a personal vendetta born from years of powerless rage. The boy who arrived as a hostage left as a man forged in silent fury, carrying a trauma that would one day be repaid with unimaginable interest. Freedom from Ottoman captivity did not mean a triumphant homecoming. Instead, Vlad Dracula returned to a Wallachia in flames. His father, Vlad the Dragon, had been betrayed and murdered by the very boyars he sought to control. His older brother, Mircea, had suffered a fate even more horrific, blinded with hot iron stakes and buried alive by the same treacherous nobles. The throne Vlad was meant to inherit, it was now a bloody prize fought over by rival factions. The young prince, hardened by years as a hostage, now faced a brutal truth. His family was gone, and his birthright was a death sentence. With support from the Ottoman governors who had once held him captive, Vlad made his first desperate grab for power. This initial rule lasted barely 2 months, a fleeting moment of control before a rival claimant, backed by the powerful Kingdom of Hungary, swept him aside. Vlad was forced to flee into the wilderness, a prince without a country, his life once again hanging by a thread. The years that followed were a masterclass in survival. He became a ghost moving through the shadows of Eastern European courts. He likely sought refuge with his cousin, Stephen, in Moldavia, another young prince learning the grim realities of rule. But his most crucial sanctuary came from an unlikely source, John Hunyadi, the very Hungarian warlord who had once supported his rival. Hunyadi, the White Knight of Christendom and a fierce opponent of the Ottomans, saw potential in the driven, vengeful young exile. Here, Vlad transformed from a fugitive into a political asset. He learned military strategy from one of Europe's finest commanders, and more importantly, he absorbed a critical lesson. Alliances are temporary, and power is the only true loyalty. He served Hunyadi, proving his worth all while waiting, watching, and planning. Every betrayal he witnessed, every murder that cleared a path to a throne, every night spent in a foreign court, it all coiled tighter inside him. The boy who was a hostage became the man who was a weapon, sharpened on the whetstone of exile, waiting for the moment to strike back at a world that had taken everything from him. The moment for his return arrived not with a fanfare but with a calculated political shift. In 1456, the great powers were realigning. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, was on the march, and Hungary's John Hunyadi needed a reliable, fiercely anti-Ottoman ruler on Wallachia's throne. Vlad Dracula, the hardened exile, was the perfect candidate. With Hungarian support and a small band of loyal soldiers, he crossed the border and seized his birthright for the second time. His coronation was not a celebration of peace, but a grim declaration of war against the chaos that had consumed his homeland. He looked out upon a shattered principality. The treasury was empty, drained by years of conflict and corruption. The land was vulnerable, a tempting target for its powerful neighbors, and within his own court, the boyar nobility watched him with cold, calculating eyes. These were the same families who had betrayed and murdered his father and brother. To them, Vlad was just another temporary prince, a pawn to be manipulated or removed when he ceased to be useful. Vlad understood this reality with chilling clarity. He had no illusions about loyalty or tradition. His governing philosophy, forged in the fires of his youth, was starkly simple: absolute authority through absolute fear. He believed that a ruler could only be strong if he was feared more than any external enemy. A disobedient subject was a greater threat than an invading army because betrayal came from within. His goal was not merely to rule, but to terrify Wallachia into a state of perfect, trembling order. To achieve this, he needed to break the old system completely, and he began with the very men who sat in his council chambers. The boyars who had grown fat on privilege and treason would learn the new rules of his reign. Their power, built on networks of family and favor, would be replaced by a single, unanswerable power, his own. He would use their wealth to fill his coffers and their fear to cement his control. But how does a prince with no army and no money make the most powerful men in the land bow to his will? The answer would soon become horrifically clear, and it would give him the name that echoes through the centuries. Vlad Dracula's reign began with a single, unshakable principle: order through absolute terror. He viewed the lawless, self-serving boyar nobility as a disease within the state, and he prescribed a cure of unimaginable brutality. His method was not random violence, but a chillingly precise code, a system of punishment designed to rewrite the social contract of Wallachia through sheer, paralyzing fear. The most infamous demonstration of this code was an event that would sear his name into history: the Easter feast of 1459. In a move of calculated political theater, Vlad invited hundreds of boyars along with their families to his palace in Targovist for a grand celebration. The atmosphere was likely tense, a fragile performance of loyalty from men who had betrayed his family. The feast proceeded, a display of wealth and power, until the moment Vlad himself rose to speak. He turned to the eldest among them and posed a simple, deadly question. "How many princes have you seen rule this land in your lifetime?" The answers varied, some saying 7, others more. Each answer was a confession of their disloyalty, proof of how easily they had switched allegiance from one ruler to the next. In Vlad's eyes, this was the root of Wallachia's weakness: a nobility with no loyalty to the throne or the people, only to their own survival. His response was immediate and horrifying. At his signal, his guards seized the entire assembly. The oldest and most influential were impaled on the spot, their families forced to watch. The younger, healthier nobles and their relatives were not killed, but condemned to a different fate: forced labor. Vlad marched them to the ruins of a remote mountain fortress, Ponari, and compelled them to rebuild it with their bare hands, dressed in fine silks that tore to rags. This was terror with a purpose. It physically eliminated his most dangerous rivals, broke the power of the noble families, and provided free labor to fortify his borders, all in one masterstroke. The Easter feast sent a message that echoed across every level of society. Disobedience to the prince meant annihilation, but Vlad's code of terror extended far beyond the nobility. He understood that for a state to function, its ordinary citizens must also obey, and he enforced this with a severity that became legendary. He declared that theft and vagrancy would not be tolerated. To prove his point, he placed a golden cup at the central public well in Targovist. Anyone was free to drink from it, but it was never to be touched. For years, the cup remained untouched, a symbol of the perfect order his reign had imposed. The penalty for any crime, from petty theft to murder, was almost always the same: impalement. Contemporary reports, though likely exaggerated, describe a forest of stakes outside the city gates, a grim warning to all who entered. The result, by all accounts, was a society of remarkable, if horrifying, public safety. A chronicler of the time noted that a person could leave a bag of gold in the middle of the road and return days later to find it untouched. This was not a sign of moral virtue, but of a population frozen in fear. Vlad had replaced the chaotic, self-interested rule of the boyars with a single, terrifying source of authority: himself. Every citizen, from the poorest farmer to the surviving noble, understood the exact and terrible cost of breaking his law. This period of order reveals the dark logic behind his brutality. In a land perpetually on the brink of invasion and internal collapse, Vlad used terror as a tool for rapid, forced state building. He centralized power, filled his treasury with confiscated boyar wealth, and created a populace too frightened to challenge him or each other. He was crafting a hardened, obedient instrument, a Wallachia that could finally stand unified against its enemies. But this unity was a fragile illusion built on a foundation of screams and stakes, and it would soon attract the attention of the greatest enemy of all. The weapon Vlad chose was not merely a method of killing, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Impalement was an ancient form of execution, but Vlad Dracula elevated it to a dark art, a public spectacle engineered to shatter the will of both the victim and the observer. The process was deliberately slow, often taking hours or even days for a person to die. A sharpened stake, usually oiled to prevent immediate internal damage, was inserted either vertically through the body or, in a more horrific variation, through the rectum and out through the shoulder or mouth. The stake was then planted upright in the ground, leaving the victim suspended, gravity slowly pulling them down the length of the wood. Death came from shock, exposure, or internal bleeding, but not before the condemned had endured unimaginable agony in full view of the community. This was the core of its power. It transformed execution into a lingering, visible lesson. A single impaled criminal outside a city gate was a stark warning against theft. A forest of thousands of stakes holding Ottoman prisoners of war, arranged in concentric circles or geometric patterns as some chroniclers claimed, was a message to an invading army, a grotesque welcome sign declaring the price of crossing his border. The terror was not just in the act itself, but in its visibility and its longevity. The bodies remained for weeks rotting in the sun, a permanent theater of suffering that poisoned the air and the psyche of all who saw it. For Vlad, this was the ultimate deterrent. It served a dual purpose domestically. It created that eerily safe society where a gold cup could sit untouched because the consequence was so vividly on display. Internationally, it was a form of asymmetric warfare. His smaller Wallachian forces could not match the Ottoman army in open battle, but they could wage a war of nerves. The sight of that grisly forest was meant to paralyze enemy troops with dread, to break their morale before the first arrow was ever fired. It was a calculated strategy to make his land seem cursed, a place where death did not come quickly in combat, but slowly and horribly in captivity. Later, in the 16th century, German pamphlets would sensationalize these accounts, adding lurid details and woodcut illustrations of Vlad dining amidst his victims, transforming historical military tactics into Gothic horror stories for a European audience hungry for the macabre. While the exact numbers and some specifics were undoubtedly exaggerated for propaganda, the central, chilling truth remains: Vlad wielded impalement not just as a punishment, but as a precise instrument of state control, crafting a landscape of fear that was both his shield and his sword. That eerie public order was a weapon in itself, a unified front Vlad now aimed directly at the Ottoman Empire. His defiance was not a sudden outburst, but a deliberate declaration of war. He halted the annual tribute of gold and young boys demanded by the Sultan, a payment known as the jizya. When Ottoman envoys arrived to remind him of his obligations, they made a fatal error. They refused to remove their turbans in his presence, a sign of disrespect. Vlad's response was swift and symbolic. He had their turbans nailed to their heads. This was the final, irrevocable break. Knowing a massive invasion was now inevitable, Vlad decided to strike first on Ottoman soil in the dead of winter. In the harsh months of 1461, he led his forces across the frozen Danube River into Bulgaria. This was not a campaign of conquest, but of pure, calculated terror. His strategy was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. He divided his cavalry into small, fast-moving units and unleashed them across the countryside. They employed scorched earth tactics, burning villages, poisoning wells, and destroying crops to deny resources to the approaching Ottoman army. But the physical destruction was only half the plan. His troops ambushed Ottoman patrols and garrison towns, vanishing back into the forests and mountains before a proper counterattack could be organized. And everywhere they went, they left behind their signature horror. Fields and roads leading to key Ottoman strongholds were lined with impaled prisoners, local collaborators, and captured soldiers. This grisly landscape served a precise military function. It was psychological artillery. The aim was to paralyze the Ottoman war machine with dread, to spread panic among the troops and the civilian population supporting them. News of this forest of the impaled traveled faster than any cavalry, sapping morale and turning the land itself into a theater of nightmares. Vlad's campaign was stunningly effective, throwing the Ottoman border region into chaos and demonstrating that the Sultan's vast empire had a vulnerable underbelly. But this brutal success was a gamble of the highest order. It was a direct personal challenge to the most powerful man in the world, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. Mehmed was a ruler who considered himself the shadow of God on earth, and he would not tolerate a defiant prince from a minor province turning his frontier into a charnel house. Vlad had lit a fuse, and now the full, overwhelming force of the Ottoman Empire began to mobilize, its sole objective to extinguish the son of the dragon forever. The response to Vlad's defiance was a force that seemed to shake the earth itself. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had shattered the thousand-year walls of Constantinople, would not be challenged by a mountain prince. He assembled a colossal army, one of the largest seen in 15th century Europe, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to over 100,000 men. This was not just a military force, it was a moving city of conquest. At its core were the elite janissaries, the Sultan's personal slave soldiers, fanatically loyal and superbly trained. They were supported by masses of skilled cavalry, heavy artillery capable of reducing fortresses, and a vast support train of engineers, cooks, and laborers. This immense host began its slow, deliberate march north toward the Danube, a tidal wave of imperial power aimed at washing Vlad Dracula and his insolent kingdom from the map. For Vlad, watching from the walls of his fortified cities, the mathematics were brutally simple. His entire fighting force, every loyal boyar, every free peasant he could muster, numbered perhaps 20,000. To meet Mehmed's juggernaut in a traditional, set-piece battle on an open field would be suicide. It would be like a dagger thrown against a stone wall. The wall would not even notice. Yet surrender was unthinkable. It would mean not only his own death, but the complete absorption of Wallachia into the Ottoman Empire, the end of his family's legacy, and the victory of everything he had spent his life fighting. He was trapped between an unstoppable force and an immovable will. His only hope lay not in matching strength, but in exploiting weakness, in turning the very size of the Ottoman army into its own greatest enemy. He would have to wage a different kind of war, one of shadows, deception, and relentless harassment. He ordered his people to retreat into the mountains and forests, burning their own crops and villages in a scorched earth policy to deny the invaders food. His cavalry, masters of the rugged terrain, broke into small, fast-moving bands. They became ghosts in the landscape, launching lightning strikes on Ottoman supply lines, ambushing scouting parties, and poisoning wells before melting back into the wilderness. Every mile the Sultan's army advanced became a mile of hardship and hidden threat. the grand invasion slowed to a grueling, frustrating crawl, plagued by hunger, disease, and the constant, gnawing fear of an enemy they could not see. This grim strategy of attrition was Vlad's only play, a desperate attempt to bleed the giant until it grew weak and angry. And it was all leading toward a final, terrible confrontation at his capital, the city of Targovist, where he had one last, horrifying spectacle prepared, a welcome for the conqueror that would test the nerves of even the most hardened soldier. The Ottoman advance finally reached the outskirts of Targovist in the summer of 1462. After weeks of grueling marches and harassing attacks, Sultan Mehmed and his vast army expected to finally corner the elusive Wallachian prince and lay siege to his capital. But as they crested the final hills, the sight that greeted them was not a city preparing for battle. It was a vision from a nightmare. For a distance of nearly 2 miles along the main road leading to the city gates and in carefully arranged concentric circles stood a forest of the dead. Thousands upon thousands of stakes held the decomposing bodies of Ottoman prisoners, captured soldiers, and Bulgarian allies. Contemporary chroniclers, writing with a mix of horror and awe, described a field of over 20,000 impaled victims. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silence was broken only by the buzzing of flies. This was Vlad's final, masterful stroke of psychological warfare, a calculated spectacle designed not to fight the army, but to destroy its will to fight. The intended impact was immediate and profound. For the common Ottoman soldier, this grisly forest was a direct assault on their morale. These were not anonymous casualties of war. They were comrades, men they had marched with, now subjected to a fate considered profoundly dishonorable and agonizing. The sheer scale of the display communicated a terrifying message about the enemy they faced. This Vlad Dracula was not a conventional ruler playing by the rules of siege and chivalry. He was a force of seemingly demonic cruelty who would transform the very landscape into a monument to suffering. The spectacle sowed deep dread, shaking the army's discipline and fighting spirit before a single Wallachian arrow was loosed. For Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the sight provoked a more complex reaction. Historical accounts from both Ottoman and Christian sources record his dismay. He is said to have gazed upon the forest and admitted, "What can be done against a man who does such things?" It was a moment of stark realization. He could take the city, certainly. His cannons could reduce Targovist's walls to rubble. But to do so would mean sending his troops into that charnel ground to fight a defender who had already demonstrated a willingness to go beyond any boundary of acceptable warfare. The cost, not just in lives but in the complete demoralization of his proud army, would be immense. Furthermore, Vlad himself was nowhere to be seen, likely having withdrawn his forces into the impassable mountains, ready to continue a guerrilla war indefinitely. Mehmed, a brilliant strategist, understood he was not facing a defeatable army, but an idea, a terrifying myth made flesh. The practical decision became clear. After a brief reconnaissance, the Sultan gave the order to withdraw. The colossal Ottoman host turned around and began the long march back to Constantinople, having achieved none of its objectives. In that moment, Vlad the Impaler achieved his greatest and most infamous tactical victory. He had repelled the most powerful military force on earth, not with armies or walls, but with a weapon crafted from pure, unadulterated terror. The forest of the Impaled had done its work. It broke the will of a conqueror. Yet this shocking victory contained the seeds of Vlad's ultimate downfall, for it proved he was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too horrifying an enemy for anyone, friend or foe, to tolerate for long. A victory built on terror is a fragile thing, for it leaves no room for loyalty, only fear. Vlad had repelled the Ottoman giant, but in doing so, he had hollowed out his own kingdom. The very methods that secured his borders, the impalements, the confiscations, the absolute rule by dread, had turned his surviving subjects against him. The boyars who had not perished at his Easter feast lived in constant, simmering hatred, their wealth and influence stripped away. the merchant class, whose trade suffered under perpetual war and harsh justice, grew resentful. Even the common people, who had benefited from the stark public order, were exhausted by the unending atmosphere of violence and the looming threat of Ottoman retribution. Vlad had unified Wallachia under a single will, but it was a unity of silent compliance, not of shared purpose. This internal fracture created a fatal weakness, one that his enemies were perfectly positioned to exploit. And the man who would walk through that open door was not a foreign sultan, but his own flesh and blood. While Vlad was distracted, campaigning against Saxon merchants in Transylvania to punish them for supporting his rivals, the final blow was being prepared. His younger brother, Radu the Handsome, stepped onto the stage. Radu was everything Vlad was not. Where Vlad was fierce and unyielding, Radu was charming and diplomatic. He had thrived in the Ottoman court, becoming a favorite of Sultan Mehmed and converting to Islam. To the Ottomans, Radu represented the perfect solution, a compliant, culturally familiar ruler who could bring Wallachia back into the fold without further bloodshed. In the autumn of 1462, as Vlad was away, Radu marched on Wallachia at the head of a fresh Ottoman army, and more importantly, with a promise of peace and normalcy. What happened next was a damning indictment of Vlad's reign. As Radu's forces approached, there was no great uprising to defend the Impaler's capital. Instead, there was a quiet, widespread defection. Boyars saw a chance to restore their privileges under a less brutal prince. Merchants saw an end to the economic isolation. Tired soldiers and peasants saw an escape from the endless cycle of horrific warfare. City gates swung open for Radu, not under assault but in weary welcome. Vlad's power, which had seemed so absolute, evaporated not from military defeat, but from a total collapse of support. He was suddenly a king without a kingdom, isolated even within his own land. With his options gone and his few remaining loyalists overwhelmed, Vlad had no choice but to abandon Wallachia. He fled north across the Carpathian Mountains, seeking refuge in the Kingdom of Hungary, the very power that had once helped him seize his throne. The prince, who had built a fortress of fear, found that its walls were made of sand, crumbling away the moment his back was turned. The Impaler was now a fugitive. His dark reign ended not by the army he had terrified, but by the hearts he had failed to win. The fortress of Visegrad was a gilded cage, a far cry from the stakes of Targovist. Vlad Dracula, the feared Impaler, now found himself a prisoner of his former ally, Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. This was not a betrayal of friendship, but a cold political calculation. King Matthias faced immense pressure. The Ottoman Empire was demanding Vlad's head as a condition for peace, and powerful Saxon merchants in Transylvania, whom Vlad had ruthlessly attacked, were lobbying fiercely for his punishment. Furthermore, having a famously brutal and unpredictable warlord as a neighbor was a liability Matthias could no longer afford. To secure his own borders and appease multiple factions, the king made a pragmatic choice. He arrested Vlad on charges of secret collaboration with the Ottomans, a claim supported by forged letters that historians now widely dismiss as propaganda. Vlad was stripped of his freedom, but not his life, becoming a valuable political pawn held in reserve. His captivity lasted for over a decade, a strange and transformative period. Confined first in Visegrad and later in Buda, he was treated with a paradoxical mix of honor and restriction. He lived in relative comfort with servants and access to books, but the walls were always there. During these long years, a profound shift occurred. Under the influence of his Hungarian captors, and likely seeing a strategic path to rehabilitation, Vlad renounced the Orthodox Christianity of his homeland and converted to Catholicism. This was a monumental step, a public alignment with the dominant faith of Western European power. It washed away, in the eyes of many, the stain of his earlier association with the schismatic East. King Matthias, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. A converted, tamed Vlad could still be useful. he arranged for Vlad to marry a member of his own extended family, a cousin named Ilona Shilagi. This marriage was the final piece of Vlad's social redemption. It formally integrated the son of the devil into the Hungarian royal court, transforming him from a monstrous outsider into a landed nobleman, a respectable member of the Christian aristocracy. The man who emerged from captivity in the late 1470s was a starkly different figure. The firebrand prince who waged war with terror was gone, replaced by a calculating courtier who understood the power of faith, family, and political alliance. He dressed in fine Hungarian fashion, attended Catholic Mass, and managed estates granted to him by the king. The rehabilitation was astonishingly complete. To the courts of Europe, Vlad Dracula was no longer the Impaler of Wallachian legend, but a pious Catholic nobleman and a loyal servant of the Hungarian crown, a living symbol of Christendom's ability to tame and redeem even its most savage defenders. This carefully crafted new identity, however, was merely a mask waiting for the right moment to slip. The throne of Wallachia still called to him, a siren song of legacy and vengeance, and the political winds were beginning to shift once more. The mask of the Hungarian courtier was never meant to last. In 1476, the political chessboard shifted once more, and Vlad Dracula saw his final chance to reclaim the throne that defined him. His old ally and cousin, Stephen the Great of Moldavia, was now a formidable power in the region, and he needed a reliable partner on Wallachia's throne to counter Ottoman influence. Even the Transylvanian Saxons, whom Vlad had once brutally punished, pragmatically threw their support behind him, preferring a strong, independent Wallachia to direct Ottoman rule. This unlikely coalition swept into Wallachia, deposing the reigning Ottoman puppet ruler Basarab Leota, and for the third and final time, Vlad Dracula seized the princely crown. This last reign, however, was a shadow of his previous rule. It lasted barely 2 months, a frantic, unstable period spent consolidating a fragile hold in a land exhausted by decades of turmoil. The fierce, unifying terror of his younger years was gone, replaced by the maneuvering of a man whose power depended entirely on the shifting loyalties of foreign backers. He was a prince restored, but the foundation of his authority was sand. Then, in late December of 1476, the story of Vlad the Impaler ended as abruptly and mysteriously as it had unfolded. The circumstances of his death are a historical puzzle, with competing accounts creating a fog of uncertainty. One version claims he fell in battle against a returning Ottoman force near Bucharest, fighting to the last. Another, darker story suggests he was assassinated by his own Wallachian boyars, who could never accept his brutal return. Perhaps the most ironic version holds that he was mistaken for an Ottoman Turk by his own allied soldiers in the confusion of combat and cut down by those he led. The truth is buried with him, and that burial site itself is a mystery. Tradition holds he was interred at the Snagov Monastery, an island fortress he had once patronized. But when archaeologists opened the supposed tomb beneath the altar in the 1930s, they found only animal bones and a few trinkets. His body has never been conclusively found. It is a fitting end for a man who became a legend, vanishing not just from life but from the very earth, leaving behind only stories that grew taller and darker with each passing year. The man was dead, but the story was just beginning to twist into something far stranger. Within months of his disappearance, Vlad Dracula's name was no longer confined to battle reports or diplomatic letters. It began to spread across Europe in a new and sensational form, the printed pamphlet. In the bustling cities of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in places like Nuremberg and Strasbourg, printers had discovered a lucrative market for shocking tales from the distant East. These early pamphlets, often illustrated with crude but vivid woodcuts, did not aim for historical accuracy. They aimed to sell, and the story of a cruel prince who impaled thousands was a bestseller. The German narratives, fueled by merchants from Transylvanian Saxon cities like Sibiu and Brasov, whom Vlad had taxed and attacked, painted him as a deranged monster. They described atrocities in gruesome detail, claiming he dined among forests of the dead, that he nailed hats to heads, and that he slaughtered peasants for sheer amusement. These stories served a dual purpose. They satisfied a public hunger for the macabre, but they also functioned as potent anti-Ottoman propaganda. By depicting Vlad as the ultimate savage, a product of the chaotic frontier between Christendom and the Islamic world, they reinforced a narrative of European cultural and moral superiority. His brutality was presented not as a complex political strategy, but as evidence of the inherent barbarism of the entire region, a place that needed to be defended from both the Ottoman threat and its own monstrous rulers. This version of Vlad was a convenient fiction, a cartoon villain whose very existence justified fear and loathing of the East. Yet, in the lands where Vlad actually ruled, a very different story was being told. Slavic chronicles from Russia and the Balkans, and the rich oral traditions of Romanian villages preserved a far more nuanced portrait. Here, Vlad was rarely called the Impaler. He was Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, yes, but the emphasis was different. In these accounts, his harshness was framed as a necessary, if severe, form of justice. He was the prince who terrified the corrupt boyars and made the roads safe. A famous Romanian anecdote tells of a golden cup placed by a well, left untouched for years because the people feared his law so completely. In these traditions, his war against the Ottomans was not the act of a madman, but of a heroic, if ruthless, defender of the Christian faith, holding back the tide of invasion with whatever terrible tools were at his disposal. This Vlad was a folk hero, a strong ruler in a time of weakness, a man who used fear to protect his people from far greater external threats. So we are left with two opposing legends born from the same man, a German monster and a Romanian hero. One was crafted by outsiders for profit and political point scoring, distributed by the revolutionary technology of the printing press. The other was carried in the memories of his subjects, passed down through songs and stories around hearths. One version was designed to horrify and alienate, the other to explain and even justify. For centuries, these two narratives existed in parallel, one spreading widely in the literate West, the other simmering locally in the oral culture of the East. They would not collide for hundreds of years, but when they finally did, they would fuse into something entirely new, something that required not just a cruel prince, but a supernatural predator. The legend of Vlad Tepes did not fade with the pamphlets. It transformed into a cornerstone of national identity. Centuries after his death, as the modern nation of Romania began to stir in the 19th century, intellectuals and artists looked back into their past, searching for heroes who could unite a fragmented people. They found Vlad. In the fires of national awakening, the brutal prince was recast, his image purified and elevated. The folk memory of the strong, just ruler who terrified the corrupt and defended the land was seized upon and amplified. He was no longer merely a harsh medieval prince. He became a symbol of Romanian resistance against centuries of foreign domination, first by the Ottomans and later by other empires. His severity was reinterpreted as a necessary strength, the only possible response to existential threats. Poets wrote verses praising his defense of Christendom. Historians highlighted his role in asserting Wallachian autonomy, and painters depicted him as a noble, almost saintly figure gazing defiantly toward the enemy. This was history serving a new purpose, crafting a foundational myth for a nation in need of unifying legends. The complexity of the man was sanded away, leaving behind a powerful archetype, the fierce father of the homeland who used any means to protect his people. Today, this legacy is set in stone and mortar. You can visit the princely church in Târgu East, built by his command, or see his portrait displayed in museums as a founding figure. In the capital city of Bucharest, a large, dramatic statue of Vlad the Impaler stands near the very palace he is said to have founded, depicting him not as a monster, but as a resolute ruler, sword in hand, watching over the city. For many Romanians, especially in an era when the country struggled to assert its place in Europe, Vlad represents an unyielding will to sovereignty. He is proof that their ancestors were not passive subjects but formidable actors on history's stage. Yet this veneration exists alongside a deep and ongoing debate. Walk into any bookstore or university in Romania today, and you will find the argument alive. One camp, often leaning on the harsh judgments of Western chronicles, sees him unequivocally as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a cruel despot whose methods of terror are indefensible in any era. They argue that celebrating him is a dangerous embrace of authoritarianism, glossing over profound suffering with nationalist paint. The other camp, drawing from the folk traditions and the political realities of the 15th century, views him as a necessary evil. They contend that in a time of perpetual invasion and internal treachery, only a leader of iron will and terrifying reputation could have preserved Wallachia's independence even for a short time. They ask a difficult historical question in the face of annihilation. Are the rules of civilized conduct a luxury a leader can afford? This is not merely an academic dispute. It is a conversation about how a nation remembers itself, about what it chooses to valorize from its past. Is Vlad Dracula a saint of sovereignty or a sinner against humanity? Perhaps he is the enduring proof that history rarely deals in simple heroes and villains, but in shadows where light and darkness are forever intertwined. The two legends, one of a national hero and the other of a barbaric monster, traveled down separate rivers of time. They would not converge until the end of the 19th century in the mind of a sickly Irish theatre manager named Bram Stoker. Stoker was not a historian seeking truth, he was a storyteller in search of a name, a single, powerful word that could encapsulate a new kind of terror. While researching for a novel about the undead, he stumbled upon a footnote in a book about Wallachia and Moldavia. There it was, a name that seemed to hiss from the page, Dracula. The text noted it meant son of the devil. For Stoker, that was all he needed. The historical Vlad, his complex political struggles, his war for independence, none of that mattered to the author. What Stoker seized upon was the raw, evocative power of the name itself and its brief, associated aura of ancient Transylvanian cruelty. This was not an act of historical borrowing, it was an act of literary alchemy. Stoker took that one potent ingredient and fused it with something entirely different, the rich, earthy vampire folklore of Eastern Europe. The vampires of peasant legend were not noble aristocrats. They were bloated, ruddy-faced corpses that rose from their graves to plague their own villages, spreading disease and draining the life from cattle and family members. They were grotesque, familiar horrors. Stoker performed a transformative act. He combined the devilish name of a cruel prince with the supernatural myth of the undead, and then he dressed this hybrid in the elegant trappings of a British aristocrat. His Count Dracula was a seductive, cultured, and immortal nobleman, a creature who could walk unseen in high society, whose evil was not one of battlefield impalements, but of a slow, corrupting invasion of the modern world, symbolized by his journey to London. Stoker's genius was in this fusion. He created a villain who was both exotic and familiar, ancient and dangerously contemporary. The historical Vlad's methods were public, theatrical, and meant to enforce a terrible order. Stoker's Count operated in shadow, his violence personal, secretive, and deeply intimate. This fictional creation was so compelling, so perfectly suited to the anxieties of the Victorian age about sexuality, disease, and foreign influence, that it consumed the original history entirely. From that moment on, the name Dracula would forever belong first to the vampire and only secondly to the prince. The man who used terror to defend a kingdom became the monster who uses charm to invade bedrooms, a transformation so complete it proves that sometimes the right story can be more powerful and more enduring than any fact. That final, mysterious disappearance from the battlefield was only the beginning of another hunt, one that continues to this very day. If we cannot fully grasp the man through history or legend, perhaps science can offer us his bones. The archaeological quest for Vlad the Impaler's physical remains is a modern detective story, a blend of medieval records, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis, all chasing a ghost. The most famous starting point is the island monastery of Snagov, nestled in a lake north of Bucharest. According to centuries-old tradition, this was Vlad's chosen burial site, a place he had richly endowed. In the 1930s, a team of archaeologists, hearts pounding with anticipation, excavated the area before the altar of the monastery church. Beneath the stone, they found a tomb. But when the lid was lifted, the promise shattered. Inside were no princely remains, only a few scattered animal bones, some fragments of a medieval costume, and a single brooch. The tomb was a cenotaph, an empty memorial. Had his body been moved for safekeeping during later turmoil? Was it destroyed by enemies, or was the tradition simply wrong from the start? The empty grave at Snagov only deepened the mystery, turning a historical question into an archaeological cold case. The search then shifted to the very heart of his power, the princely court in Bucharest. During restoration work in the early 21st century, archaeologists uncovered a hidden network of tombs beneath the old church ruins on the site. One chamber held a particular fascination, a crypt containing a coffin draped with purple cloth, a color long associated with royalty and mourning. The excitement was palpable. Could this finally be the Impaler's lost resting place? Yet, when researchers analyzed the remains, they were met with another frustrating dead end. The skeleton belonged to a woman. Each potential lead seemed to dissolve upon contact, reinforcing the idea that Vlad, in death as in life, was a master of evasion. Then a claim emerged from an entirely unexpected corner of Europe. In 2014, researchers at the University of Tallinn in Estonia made a startling announcement. They had been studying a headless skeleton unearthed in Naples, Italy, from a church cemetery. The bones, they argued, showed signs of a violent death and were wrapped in a luxurious silk shroud embroidered with the emblem of the Order of the Dragon, the very chivalric brotherhood Vlad's father had joined. How could the prince's remains have possibly ended in Italy? The theory is a convoluted saga involving his daughter, who was allegedly married to a Neapolitan nobleman, and the possibility that loyal supporters smuggled his body to safety. The initial DNA analysis seemed promising, showing a possible blood relation to descendants of Vlad's lineage, but the scientific community met the claim with intense skepticism. The chain of custody for the bones was unclear, the historical documentation thin, and other experts pointed out that the dragon emblem was used by other members of the order, not just the Dracula family. The headless skeleton remains a controversial footnote, an intriguing maybe that has yet to convince most historians. This persistent lack of a definitive body is perhaps the final, fitting layer to Vlad's story. He has become a literal ghost in the machine of history. The empty tombs and disputed bones mean there is no closure, no final piece of evidence to lock his story into a single, undeniable truth. This absence actively fuels the legend. It allows every theory, from the heroic to the monstrous, to breathe. It turns his legacy into a living puzzle, inviting each new generation of researchers, armed with more advanced technology, to take up the search. The question of where he lies is no longer just about locating bones. It is about pinning down a myth, about using carbon dating and genetics to answer a question that lives somewhere between history and nightmare. And as long as that grave remains unfound, the enigmatic shadow of Vlad Dracula will continue to stretch across the centuries, daring us to solve him. So we are left with a puzzle of flesh and bone, of myth and memory. To truly understand the man behind the legend, we must attempt a perilous journey, not across borders, but into the mind of Vlad Dracula himself. Modern psychology offers us a set of lenses through which to view his actions, but each lens reveals a different, fragmented portrait, and none provide a perfect fit. The simplest and perhaps most tempting explanation is to label him a sociopath, a person devoid of empathy who used cruelty as a tool for personal gain without remorse. The sheer scale and theatricality of his violence, the apparent emotional detachment in reports of him dining amidst his victims, seem to support this. Yet this label feels incomplete, a clinical term that flattens a deeply complex historical figure into a two-dimensional monster. It fails to account for the stark political logic behind his terror, a logic that, however horrifying, was aimed at a specific goal: state survival. A pure sociopath acts for personal gratification or power alone, but Vlad's brutality was consistently directed outward, against groups he perceived as enemies of the state: the boyars, the Ottomans, criminals. This suggests a warped sense of purpose, not its absence. This leads us to the second powerful lens, that of profound childhood trauma. His psyche was forged in a crucible of betrayal and fear. Torn from his family as a young boy and sent to a gilded prison, he learned that the world was a place where the powerful held absolute life and death control over the helpless. The subsequent murders of his father and brother by the boyars confirmed this worldview in the most devastating way possible. Trust was not just foolish, it was fatal. In this light, his entire reign can be seen as a preemptive strike against a world he believed would inevitably betray him. His paranoia was not a disorder, but a learned survival strategy. The constant, looming threat of assassination or invasion meant that for Vlad, terror was not merely a tactic of rule, it was a necessary condition of his own survival. He created a world of absolute control because the world of his youth had been one of absolute vulnerability. Every impalement could be interpreted as a desperate attempt to impale his own childhood fears, to pin them down and display them so they could never harm him again. Perhaps the most compelling view is to see him as a brutal strategic genius, a Machiavellian prince centuries before Machiavelli wrote his famous treatise. In this analysis, his cruelty was not a symptom of madness, but a cold, rational calculation. He inherited a weak, fractured state caught between two empires. Conventional diplomacy and military strength were not options, so he weaponized psychology itself. He understood that in a world of limited resources, fear was a force multiplier. A forest of stakes could do the work of 10,000 soldiers. By making his name synonymous with a fate worse than battlefield death, he aimed to deter invasion, crush internal dissent, and force a chaotic society into a harsh, unified order. From this perspective, he was a master of asymmetric warfare, using the only tool at his disposal, psychological horror, to achieve political ends that were, in his context, arguably rational: the preservation of Wallachian autonomy. His mistake, if we can call it that, was underestimating how that same terror would eventually corrode the loyalty of his own people, leaving him isolated when his brother offered peace. The truth likely lies in a toxic fusion of all these elements. He was a traumatized child who became a strategic adult, his personal pathologies perfectly aligned with his political necessities. His lack of empathy, whether innate or forged in captivity, allowed him to employ methods that would have broken a more conventional ruler. His traumatic past provided the emotional fuel for a relentless, vengeful drive. And his strategic mind channeled that drive into a coherent, if monstrous, state-building project. He was not a sociopath ruling a peaceful kingdom for pleasure, nor a purely rational statesman in a calm era. He was a deeply damaged individual whose personal demons found a perfect outlet in the horrific demands of his time and place. To diagnose him is to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the very traits we would call pathological in a peaceful society can become instruments of survival and even temporary success in a world perpetually at the brink of collapse. His darkness was not an aberration, but a reflection of the world that made him. That unresolved psychological puzzle has been handed down through the centuries, not to historians but to storytellers. The figure of Vlad Dracula has been endlessly reshaped by popular culture, each new medium molding him to fit its own fears and fantasies. The journey begins in black and white with Bela Lugosi's iconic 1931 portrayal. This Dracula was not a raging warlord but a silent, hypnotic aristocrat. Lugosi gave us the slow, deliberate speech, the piercing gaze, and the elegant cape, creating an image of supernatural menace that was seductive rather than savage. He was a creature of shadow and suggestion, his power lying in charm and mind control, a far cry from the very public physical terror of the historical Vlad. This version cemented the vampire as a figure of Gothic romance and aristocratic decay. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, Christopher Lee unleashed a different kind of monster. His Dracula, in a series of Hammer horror films, was a force of raw, animalistic fury. He was physically powerful, with fangs bared and eyes blazing red, a predator driven by primal hunger and rage. Lee's portrayal tapped into a different aspect of the myth, the beast within the gentleman, and in doing so, he echoed the historical Vlad's capacity for explosive, terrifying violence, even if the context was entirely supernatural. These two iconic performances set the poles for the cinematic Dracula, the seducer and the savage, and every portrayal since has danced somewhere between them. But what about the man behind the myth? Occasionally, popular culture attempts to look past the fangs. Films like Dark Prince, the true story of Dracula, try to anchor the story in the 15th century, depicting Vlad as a tragic, if brutal, ruler fighting for his homeland. These historical dramas grapple with the political complexity and moral ambiguity that the vampire tales ignore, showing a leader making horrific choices in impossible circumstances. They serve as a counter-narrative, a reminder that a real person existed before the legend consumed him. Yet even these attempts are just another layer of fiction, an interpretation that selects which historical facts to highlight and which to soften for a modern audience. The blurring of lines accelerates when we step into the realm of interactive media. In the legendary video game series Castlevania, Dracula is a recurring demonic lord, a force of pure supernatural evil who must be defeated generation after generation. Here, the name is merely a vessel for epic boss battles and Gothic atmosphere, stripped of any historical trace. Conversely, games like the strategy title Age of Empires too include Vlad the Impaler as a playable historical campaign hero, focusing entirely on his military tactics against the Ottomans, completely ignoring the vampire myth. Anime and manga have also embraced the figure, often blending the historical and the monstrous into entirely new hybrids. Hellsing presents Alucard, a powerful vampire working for a secret British organization, a being of immense power whose backstory is loosely tangled with the history of Wallachia. Even comedy gets in on the act, from Mel Brooks' Dracula, Dead and Loving It, to the animated Hotel Transylvania, where the Count is a lovable, overprotective dad. Each of these adaptations performs a careful act of curation. They pick and choose elements from the vast buffet of available lore, a name here, a setting there, a trait of cruelty or charisma, and discard the rest. The historical Vlad's strategic use of terror becomes a vampire's inherent bloodlust. His defense of Christendom becomes a generic battle between good and evil. His complex political marriage becomes a tragic romance with a reincarnated lover. Popular culture is not interested in historical accuracy, it is interested in symbolic power. The name Dracula has become a shorthand, a reusable icon that can be plugged into any story needing a figure of ancient, aristocratic, or terrifying power. Every time he appears on screen, in a game or in a comic, the line between the 15th century prince and the immortal monster becomes fainter. The man who fought for a kingdom is now a brand, a versatile piece of intellectual property whose true story is buried ever deeper beneath an avalanche of fiction. This endless adaptation raises a fascinating question. When a historical figure becomes a myth, Who does he truly belong to, the scholars trying to uncover him, or the artists who keep reinventing him? Across the Carpathian Mountains and beyond the Danube, the story of Vlad Dracula is told with a different emphasis, one not of national pride or Gothic horror, but of imperial memory. In the vast archives of the Ottoman Empire, the Prince of Wallachia was not a vampire, but a specific and notorious kind of enemy. Ottoman chroniclers gave him a title that was both descriptive and dismissive: Kazikli Bey, the Impaler Lord. This name captures the essence of how he was viewed, a local ruler defined by a single, horrific tactic, a troublesome thorn in the side of a much larger body. Within the grand narrative of Ottoman history, Vlad's rebellion was a dramatic but ultimately brief episode. The empire, at its zenith under Mehmed the Conqueror, was a sprawling entity administering millions of subjects across 3 continents. A regional insurrection by a minor prince, while shocking and personally infuriating to the Sultan, was a matter for the border governors to manage, not an existential threat to the state itself. Ottoman records acknowledge his effectiveness in spreading terror and his skill in guerrilla warfare, but they frame it as the temporary success of a particularly vicious bandit, not the strategic triumph of a peer. His cruelty was noted, but it was often contextualized within a broader understanding of frontier politics, where such brutality, while extreme, was not entirely unfamiliar. The Ottoman response itself is telling. After the failure of the 1462 campaign, they did not commit another colossal army solely for Vlad. Instead, they employed a more subtle and ultimately more effective weapon, his own brother, Radu. This was a classic Ottoman strategy, using diplomacy, familial rivalry, and the promise of stable trade to undermine a violent opponent. It worked perfectly, demonstrating that the empire preferred to absorb and neutralize threats through political means whenever possible, viewing military force as a last resort. In modern Turkey, this perspective endures. Vlad the Impaler is a known historical figure, studied in schools as a fierce adversary during the empire's expansion into Europe. He is remembered for his defiance and his notorious methods, but he does not occupy the same monumental space in the national consciousness as he does in Romania. For Turkey, the long arc of history encompasses the rise and fall of a 600-year empire, with Vlad appearing as a vivid, dark flash in a much longer and more complex story. His legacy is one of a formidable obstacle that was, in time, circumvented. This Ottoman viewpoint is crucial for balance. It pulls the camera back from the close-up on Wallachia and shows the wider geopolitical chessboard. It reminds us that one nation's heroic defender is another empire's brutal insurgent, and that history's judgment is often a matter of where you stand on the map. The Impaler Lord was a storm that raged fiercely at the border, but the Ottoman Empire was the deep, ancient sea that eventually weathered it and flowed on. The empty grave and the disputed bones have not stopped the legend, they have fueled an entire industry. Today, the name Dracula is not just a story, it is an economic engine, a brand that draws hundreds of thousands of visitors to Romania every year, transforming whispers of the past into a very modern form of currency. This is the Dracula economy, a fascinating and sometimes awkward dance between global myth and national history. At its heart stands a picturesque fortress perched on a rocky cliff, its towers pointing sharply into the Transylvanian sky, Bran Castle. Thanks to a clever but historically tenuous marketing campaign in the 1970s, this medieval stronghold has become universally known as Dracula's Castle. The connection is romantic, but it is almost entirely fictional. Bram Stoker likely never saw an image of Bran, and while Vlad may have passed through the area, there is no evidence he ever owned or lived in the castle. Yet, this detail hardly matters to the long lines of tourists snaking up the hill. They come seeking a tangible connection to the myth, to walk through stone corridors and imagine the presence of the vampire count. The castle's management expertly caters to this desire, offering everything from historical exhibits about medieval life to during Halloween, full-blown vampire-themed parties and haunted house experiences. The commercial reach extends far beyond Bram's walls. You can stay in Dracula-themed hotels, dine at restaurants named for him, and buy everything from fang-shaped bottle openers to blood-red wine with his likeness on the label. Entire festivals, like the annual Dracula Film Festival in Brasov, celebrate the cinematic legacy. For many local communities, especially in the regions surrounding the castles and historic sites, this tourism is a vital source of income and jobs, a way to turn a dark legend into a bright future. But this embrace of the myth creates a profound and persistent tension. On one hand, the global Dracula brand is an undeniable marketing powerhouse. It puts Romania on the map for millions of people who might never have considered visiting otherwise. It creates a compelling, easily understood narrative that drives revenue and supports local economies. The myth is a gateway, a first point of contact that sparks curiosity. On the other hand, this commercial spectacle often overshadows and at times actively distorts the nuanced and significant history it supposedly represents. The vampire narrative can reduce Romania's rich, complex past to a single note of Gothic horror, reinforcing old stereotypes of the region as a mysterious, backward land of superstition. For historians and cultural purists, this is a constant frustration. They watch as the brutal, politically strategic prince of Wallachia is flattened into a cartoon monster or a romanticized aristocrat, his real story lost amidst plastic fangs and souvenir capes. The question becomes, does the myth help or hinder a true understanding of the real Vlad and Romanian history? The answer is not simple. For some visitors, the Dracula hook is merely an entry point. They come for the vampire, but they stay for the history. A tour of Bran Castle might begin with vampire lore, but a good guide will also explain the castle's real purpose as a medieval customs post and fortress, and the exhibits inside detail the life of Queen Marie, a much later and beloved royal resident. The curiosity sparked by the fictional Dracula can lead travelers to seek out the authentic sites, like the ruins of the princely court in Targovist or the mountain fortress of Ponari, places that speak to the historical Vlad's real struggles and achievements. In this way, the myth acts as a lure, drawing people into a deeper engagement with the country's heritage they might otherwise have missed. Yet for many others, the commercial experience is the entirety of the engagement. They leave with a bag of kitsch and a head full of Hollywood imagery, having learned little about the actual 15th century or the modern nation they visited. The challenge for Romania is one of balance, how to profit from the undeniable appeal of the global brand without allowing it to completely consume the nation's own historical narrative. Can the country be both the home of the world's most famous vampire and a respected modern European state with a proud, complex history? The Dracula economy suggests it is trying, walking a tightrope between capitalizing on a fantastical story and educating about a factual one. Perhaps this very tension is the most fitting modern legacy for Vlad the Impaler, a figure forever caught between competing truths, his memory now a valuable commodity in a marketplace of ideas where history and fantasy are forever for sale. The greatest mysteries about Vlad are not in his actions but in his very being, lost to the shadows of time. We do not know where his body lies, turning his grave into a historical ghost story. We cannot even be certain of his true face. The most famous image, the portrait at Ambras Castle in Austria, shows a man with a heavy mustache, deep-set eyes, and an intense, unsettling gaze. But this painting was created decades after his death, likely based on second-hand descriptions or even the artist's own imagination. Is it a reliable likeness or just another layer of propaganda designed to match the monster of German pamphlets? Without a confirmed skull to reconstruct, his visage remains an artist's interpretation, leaving us to wonder what the real man who inspired such fear actually looked upon the world. The numbers of his victims are another foggy battlefield. chroniclers, both friendly and hostile, threw out staggering figures claiming he impaled tens of thousands. Yet these accounts are fraught with exaggeration, political motive, and the medieval habit of using large numbers to signify a great many. Separating the grim reality of his state-sanctioned terror from the inflated propaganda meant to demonize him is nearly impossible. We know he killed on a massive scale to achieve his political ends, but the precise tally is forever beyond our reach, lost in a wilderness of ancient hyperbole. And then there is the final personal mystery, the moment of his death. Did he fall in battle, cut down by an Ottoman soldier? Was he assassinated by one of his own boyars in a final act of vengeance? Or was his end a tragic mistake, struck down by an allied soldier who failed to recognize him in the chaos? Each version offers a different ending to his brutal saga, a hero's fall, a tyrant's justice, or a cruel twist of fate. The silence surrounding his last breath is absolute. These unanswered questions are not mere historical gaps, they are the very reason his legend refuses to die. A fully solved puzzle loses its power to captivate. But a figure like Vlad, missing his face, his body, and the truth of his final hour, becomes a perpetual ghost in the machine of history. We are left peering into the 15th century, trying to discern a man who seems to deliberately recede the closer we look, ensuring that the real Dracula will always be just out of reach, a silhouette against a blood-red sunset. To judge Vlad the Impaler by our modern sensibilities is to miss the point entirely. The 15th century was not an age of human rights or gentle diplomacy. It was a brutal theater where power was seized and held through fear and force. Placing Vlad alongside his contemporaries reveals a chilling truth. His methods, while extreme, were part of a grim spectrum of violence accepted by the era. Consider his great adversary, Sultan Mehmed II, celebrated as a conqueror and a patron of the arts. When Mehmed took Constantinople in 1453, he did not simply occupy the city. Following a 3-day sack, his troops were permitted to rape, loot, and enslave tens of thousands of its citizens as a standard reward for victory, a common practice meant to terrorize future enemies into submission. Mehmed himself ordered the execution of the last Byzantine emperor's young nephews to eliminate any rival claim to the throne. This was not considered monstrous, it was considered prudent statecraft. Look west to the fractured city-states of Italy, where Cesare Borgia, a contemporary prince hailed by Machiavelli as the ideal ruler, maintained his power through a campaign of calculated assassinations, betrayals, and public executions of his own rivals. His cruelty was strategic, theatrical, and entirely expected. Even within the heart of Christian Europe, sanctioned terror was an instrument of order. The Spanish Inquisition, formally established in 1478, just 2 years after Vlad's death, used torture and public burnings at the stake, known as auto de fe, to enforce religious conformity, creating a climate of fear in the name of spiritual purity. The key difference lies not in the existence of brutality, but in its style and documentation. Vlad's impalements were a public, visceral form of psychological warfare designed for a specific military and political context, the deterrence of a vastly superior enemy. His infamy was amplified because his signature method was so visually horrific and easily described, perfect fodder for the emerging print culture that craved sensational stories from the exotic East. Mehmed's sack of a city or the Inquisition's slow burn of heretics were, in their own time, seen as the grim necessities of empire or faith. Vlad's actions, however, were recorded and broadcast by his enemies, the German merchants and pamphleteers, who had a vested interest in painting him as a uniquely demonic figure, a symbol of the barbaric frontier. His lasting notoriety, then, is less a verdict on his singular evil and more a testament to the power of a compelling, marketable narrative. The world has always had its brutal rulers, but few had the misfortune of having their cruelty so perfectly captured in a story that later centuries would fuse with an even more potent myth of the undead. That unresolved tension between history and horror is precisely where we find his darker truth. After this journey through the ruins of his castles and the pages of his legends, we are left not with a simple monster, but with a chillingly complex man. The real Vlad Dracula was not a creature who feared the cross, but a prince who wielded terror as a cross of his own making. His darker truth is not that he was more monstrous than the vampire, but that he was something far more unsettling, a human being whose actions, while horrific, followed a brutal logic of his time and place. He was a traumatized child who became a strategic adult, his personal demons perfectly aligned with his political necessities. To see him only as a bloodthirsty tyrant is to ignore the boy held hostage, the son who witnessed his family's betrayal, the ruler inheriting a collapsing state. To see him only as a national hero is to sanitize the forests of the dead and the calculated cruelty. The true darkness lies in the fusion, in the understanding that a person can be both a victim of profound trauma and a perpetrator of unforgivable violence, that strategic genius can be channeled through monstrous means. This makes him more terrifying than any supernatural myth because he was real. His story forces us to confront a difficult question: what are we, as ordinary people, capable of when forged in a crucible of constant fear, betrayal, and war? The vampire is a safe fantasy, an external evil we can stake and be done with. The historical Vlad is a mirror, reflecting the potential for darkness within the human struggle for power and survival. His legacy today is a palimpsest, a parchment where the original writing of his life has been scraped away, only to have new layers of propaganda, national identity, and Gothic fiction written over it. We see not one man, but many, each version crafted to serve a purpose, to sell a pamphlet, to unite a nation, to sell a movie ticket. In the end, the story of Vlad the Impaler reveals less about a 15th century prince and more about us, about what each era fears, desires, and needs from its monsters. We invented the vampire because the truth of the man was too complex, too human, and in its own way far too dark to bear. The journey from historical prince to pop culture vampire and back again is a story about storytelling itself. We began with a creature of the night, a fictional count from Transylvania, and traced that myth backward to its source, a flesh and blood ruler named Vlad Dracula. We saw a man shaped by captivity and betrayal, who used terror as a tool to forge a fragile state from chaos. We watched as his real history was first twisted into propaganda, then reborn as national myth, and finally transformed into a global icon of the supernatural. Each version, the monster, the hero, the vampire, tells us more about the people who crafted it than the man who inspired it. Vlad the Impaler stands as a dark mirror, reflecting not only the brutal necessities of a war-torn age, but our own endless, complicated fascination with the monstrous. We are drawn to the shadow he casts because it forces us to ask where the line truly lies between a ruthless defender and a savage tyrant, and what that ambiguity says about the human capacity for violence in the name of survival or faith. So now we turn the question to you. After this journey through fact and fiction, what aspect of Vlad's story lingers in your mind? Is it the strategic horror of his psychological warfare, the tragic trauma of his youth, or the sheer power of a name to transcend history itself? Let us know in the comments below which truth you find most shocking or intriguing. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the man behind the myth, be sure to subscribe. We are just getting started, and there are countless more mysteries waiting to be unraveled where history and legend collide.